My name is Zelda Jones, and I was 30 years old when my life split cleanly in half just 1 month before my wedding. People love to say betrayal comes with warning signs. Looking back, they expect you to point out the cracks, the red flags, the moments that should have tipped you off. But the truth is, my life looked perfect right up until it wasn't. If anything, it felt stable, predictable, safe. That's what makes what happened hurt so much more. My fiance, Daniel, and I had been together since our junior year of high school. We grew up side by side. Graduations, college stress, bad apartments, first real jobs. We knew each other's routines, fears, and dreams so intimately that getting engaged felt less like a milestone and more like the natural next step, something we'd been quietly preparing for our entire adult lives. When Daniel proposed, my parents cried. My friends screamed. Even my older sister, Melissa, hugged me and joked that it was about time. I had no idea she was already sleeping with him. According to them, it started a few days after our engagement. Melissa pulled Daniel aside and confessed that she'd always had feelings for him. She told him she couldn't let me get married without being honest, that she needed closure before it was too late. What she didn't expect, what I never could have imagined, was that he didn't shut her down. He listened. He stayed. They told me later that it felt confusing, that emotions blurred lines, that Melissa convinced herself she was doing the right thing by saying something now instead of living with regret forever. Daniel claimed he felt overwhelmed, torn between loyalty and curiosity. Curiosity. That word still makes my stomach turn. For months after that conversation, they flirted behind my back, sometimes at family gatherings, sometimes in the same room as me. She'd brush his arm when I turned away. He'd linger too long in conversation with her. Little things I brushed off because she was my sister and he was my fiancé. Two people I trusted without question. They said Melissa wasn't even sure about him at first, that she stayed quiet because she didn't want to ruin my happiness, that she kept telling herself it would pass. It didn't. 5 years ago, just weeks before my wedding, Melissa and Daniel asked me to come over to my parents' house. They said it was important, that they needed to talk. My parents were already there when I arrived. That should have been my first clue. We sat around the dining table. No one met my eyes. The air felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. I remember gripping the edge of the chair, waiting for someone to explain why my heart was suddenly racing. Melissa went first. She said she was pregnant. For a second, my mind refused to process the words. Pregnant. With whose? That question never made it out of my mouth. Daniel stared at the floor. Melissa continued, her voice shaking as she said she and Daniel were in love, that they'd been seeing each other for months, that she couldn't marry him to me knowing what she felt, that they planned to be together. I laughed. I actually laughed because the alternative, believing her, felt impossible. I told Daniel to come home with me. I begged him. I said we could fix this, that whatever mistake this was, it didn't have to define us. I told him I loved him, that we had a life planned, that I was willing to forgive him if he just chose me. That's when my mother intervened. She told me to stop being dramatic. She said Melissa was pregnant and needed support, that Daniel and Melissa were adults who had made their decision, that it wasn't my place to interfere or make things harder for them. I remember staring at her, waiting for her to realize what she was saying. She didn't. Instead, she went on about how excited she was to finally be a grandmother, about how fragile Melissa was right now, about how I needed to be understanding and selfless for the sake of the family. My father looked ashamed. He barely spoke. When he did, it was only to murmur that he was sorry, that he wished things had happened differently. He tried to comfort me, but my mother shut that down too. In that moment, I understood something devastating. They had already chosen. The wedding was canceled within days. My parents paid for it, as if that somehow made everything okay. Melissa moved Daniel into their house because his own parents refused to speak to him after learning the truth. And me? I became an inconvenience. The daughter who couldn't handle the situation maturely, the sister who was holding on to anger, the problem that needed to go away so everyone else could move on. I packed my things and left. No dramatic goodbye, no final confrontation. I didn't have the strength. That was the day I stopped being part of my own family. For the next 5 years, there was nothing but silence. No calls, no apologies, no attempts to check on me. The only person who ever reached out was my father, and even then, I couldn't bring myself to answer. I spent years in therapy trying to untangle what had happened, trying to understand how the people who were supposed to protect me had turned against me so easily. I wasn't healed, not even close, but I was surviving. I later found out Melissa gave birth to a son. A paternity test confirmed he was Daniel's, not mine, in case there had ever been any doubt. They got married not long after. I assumed they were happy. I assumed the story ended there. I was wrong. The 5 years after I walked away from my family didn't heal me the way people like to imagine time does. They didn't magically close the wound. They didn't dull the memories. If anything, time made everything sharper, because once the shock faded, I was left alone with the truth. I had been replaced. At first, I couldn't even say Daniel's name without feeling physically ill. I moved apartments twice within a year because every corner of my old place reminded me of wedding plans that never happened. I avoided grocery stores where couples picked out cakes. I stopped attending family-oriented holidays altogether. Therapy became my lifeline. Week after week, I sat in a small room explaining how betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the people who watched you grow up. I learned new words for what had happened to me: emotional abandonment, scapegoating, conditional love. None of them made it hurt less, but they made it clearer. What hurt the most wasn't Daniel leaving. It was my family staying. They stayed with Melissa. They stayed with him. They stayed with the version of the story where I was too sensitive and unable to move on. I didn't hear from them directly, but relatives kept me informed. Apparently, Melissa had a son. Apparently, everyone was thrilled. Apparently, my mother bragged about becoming a grandmother like nothing had ever gone wrong. A paternity test confirmed the baby was Daniel's. That confirmation felt strange. On one hand, it erased the final thread tying me to that nightmare. On the other, it made everything permanent. There was no undoing it. No chance that the universe would correct itself. They got married. 5 years passed like that. Me on the outside, building a fragile version of a life, and them playing house in the same family I used to belong to. I dated casually, but kept everyone at arm's length. I smiled when expected, laughed when appropriate, and went home feeling hollow. I told myself I was fine. I told everyone else the same. I wasn't. Then, about a week ago, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something about that call felt heavy, like it carried weight. When I checked my email afterward, I saw a message from my mother. She said she needed to speak to me urgently. Curiosity won. When I called her back, she was crying so hard I could barely understand her. She told me Melissa had been in a hit-and-run accident, that the impact had been severe, that she was in a coma and doctors didn't know when or if she would wake up. For a moment, everything else fell away. Despite everything she had done, Melissa was still my sister. My chest tightened as the reality sank in. I thought my mother was calling to ask me to come to the hospital, to be there, to sit in silence if nothing else. I was prepared to do that. But that's not why she called. She took a breath and said something that made my skin crawl. She said she needed me to step up. At first, I didn't understand. I asked her what she meant. She explained that now that Melissa was basically not there, someone needed to take care of Daniel and the child. Not just emotionally, not just financially. She wanted me to move in with them. She wanted me to replace my sister. She spoke as if this were logical, as if this were a reasonable expectation. She even said she would have taken them in herself, but she was too old to manage everything. I felt something snap. 5 years of silence. 5 years of no concern for my mental health. 5 years of pretending I didn't exist. And now she wanted me to clean up the mess. I told her no. Not politely, not gently. I told her she was out of her mind for even asking, that Daniel and the child had their own family. That I owed them nothing. She argued. She guilted. She reminded me that family sticks together. I hung up, and then I blocked her. The rest of that day passed in a blur. I went through the motions, work, errands, small talk, but my thoughts kept circling back. Not to guilt, to disbelief. Later that evening, I called my father. It was awkward. We hadn't spoken in 5 years. But I hoped, stupidly, that he would be reasonable. That he would understand why my mother's request was unacceptable. Instead, he agreed with her. He told me that Daniel and I had history, that I was still family, that stepping in wasn't unreasonable, that if anyone should be counted on, it should be me. I ended the call shaking. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about how easily they erased me before, and how easily they expected me to return now that it was convenient. How quickly they reframed my trauma into an obligation. I knew one thing with absolute clarity. If I gave in, I would lose myself all over again. So I didn't go to the hospital. I didn't call anyone. I disappeared again, this time by choice. I thought blocking my parents would bring relief. Instead, it brought noise, just not the kind I expected. For the first few days, I avoided everyone. I didn't answer texts from extended family. I skipped social media entirely. I convinced myself that silence was the safest place to be, that if I didn't hear anything, nothing could hurt me. That illusion shattered quickly. It started with a message from my aunt. She asked me, carefully, gently, if what my parents were saying was true. I didn't understand what she meant, so I asked her to explain. She hesitated, then told me my parents had been telling people that I refused to visit Melissa because I thought her accident was karma, that I had said she deserved what happened to her, that I wanted nothing to do with that child because he wasn't mine. I stared at my phone in disbelief. I had never said anything even remotely close to that. The lies spread fast. Apparently, every visitor at the hospital heard some version of the story where I was cold, heartless, and vindictive, where I turned my back on the family out of spite, where I lacked basic human empathy. What hurt wasn't just the lies, it was how easy they were to tell. Some relatives reached out to verify the story. Others didn't. I answered every message calmly, explaining what had actually happened, what my mother had asked of me, what I had refused, and why. Most of them believed me, but the damage was done. I realized then that my parents weren't grieving. They were redirecting. They needed someone to blame, someone to absorb their fear and frustration. And as always, I was the easiest target. A week passed like that. Every day brought a new message, a new reminder that my name was being dragged through conversations I wasn't part of. Then my mother showed up at my house. I came home from work and saw her standing by my driveway like she belonged there. My stomach dropped. For a split second, I considered getting back into my car and driving away. But she saw me, so I got out. I refused to let her inside. We stood in the front yard, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows between us. At first, she made small talk, asked about my job, my health, how I'd been doing. I didn't answer much. Eventually, I asked her why she was lying about me. Her face changed instantly. I told her I knew what she'd been saying to people, that I had never wished harm on Melissa, that I had never celebrated the accident, that I just wanted to move on with my life. I told her, quietly, that after everything, it was hard for me to even think of them as family anymore. She listened in silence. For a moment, I thought maybe this was it. Maybe she had come to apologize. She said she had. She told me she and my father had been thinking a lot, that they realized they hadn't treated me well over the past 5 years, that they understood why I was hurt, that she wanted us to start over because during times like this, families should stick together. I was exhausted, emotionally drained. I told her I didn't want to talk anymore that day, that if she truly wanted to fix things, we could discuss it another time. That's when she exploded. She said I should be grateful they hadn't disowned me already, that after the way I reacted to Melissa's accident, she had half a mind to make sure the rest of the family cut me off permanently. I asked her what she meant. She said I hadn't sounded sad enough on the phone, that she expected tears, panic, desperation, that my calm tone proved how little I cared. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told her grief doesn't always look dramatic, that shock doesn't always come with sobbing, that I had been upset, deeply so, even if she couldn't see it. She waved that off. Then she brought up Daniel and the child again, said my refusal to step in showed how selfish I truly was, how I was still punishing everyone for something that happened years ago. That was it. I told her to leave. She kept yelling. Neighbors started watching. My hands were shaking as I unlocked my door. I went inside and told her through the door that if she didn't leave, I would call the police. She cursed at me, told me I would regret this, that consequences were coming. And then she finally walked away. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 days later, my phone rang at 5 a.m. I didn't recognize the number. I answered groggily. It was my father. He started yelling immediately, so fast and so loud that I didn't even have time to hang up. He called me ungrateful, heartless, a disappointment. He said he wished I had never been born. He said he was going to make sure the rest of the family never spoke to me again. Then he hung up. I sat on my bed in the dark, my heart racing, my mind numb. At the time, it felt surreal. Looking back now, it feels almost absurd how desperate they were to control the narrative, to force me back into a role I had never chosen. They failed. Most of my relatives knew me better than that. They knew what had happened 5 years ago. They knew who had been wronged. And for the first time, I stopped questioning myself. I wasn't heartless. I wasn't cruel. I was protecting myself. Melissa eventually started showing signs of improvement. I heard about it through cousins. She wasn't out of danger yet, but she was responsive. I hoped she recovered. Truly. But I also knew something with painful clarity. No matter what happened next, I could never go back. By the time Melissa started showing real signs of recovery, something inside me had already hardened. Not in a cruel way, not in the way my parents like to describe it. It was more like clarity, cold, sharp, undeniable. The kind that settles in after you've been pushed past your limit and realize there's nothing left to negotiate. For nearly a month after my father's early morning phone call, I lived in a state of constant vigilance. I kept my phone on silent. I screened every unknown number. I avoided places where I might run into extended family who could unknowingly carry messages from my parents. And yet their presence lingered everywhere. Relatives told me my parents were still talking about me, still rewriting the story, still insisting that I was emotionally unstable, that grief had made me bitter, that I was refusing to help out of spite instead of self-preservation. I didn't correct every lie. I didn't need to anymore. The people who mattered knew the truth. The ones who didn't never really had my back to begin with. About 26 days after the accident, the news broke that Melissa was officially out of the coma. She wasn't fully conscious yet, but she was responding. Doctors called it a positive turn. I felt relief, and nothing else. No urge to rush to the hospital, no sudden regret, just relief that another human being wasn't dying. That reaction alone told me everything I needed to know about how far removed I had become from my old life. My parents, however, took the news as a green light. I didn't hear from my mother directly, but my father tried again, this time using different numbers, different times of day. When I didn't respond, he left voicemails accusing me of tearing the family apart during their most vulnerable moment. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so exhausting. The final straw came on a Tuesday morning. I had just settled into work when my phone lit up with a flood of messages from cousins and aunts. Apparently, my parents had started telling people that I was planning to run away, so I wouldn't have to face what I'd done, that I was unstable, that I needed help. They were laying the groundwork. I realized then that this wasn't just about guilt or grief anymore. It was about control, about forcing me back into a system where my feelings didn't matter, and my role was to absorb everyone else's mess. That night, I made a decision. I wrote a single message and sent it to the relatives I trusted most. I explained everything, clearly, calmly, without dramatics. I told them what my parents had asked of me, what they'd said, what they continued to demand. And then I stepped back. I blocked my parents everywhere. Phone, email, social media, everything. For the first time since the betrayal, I felt something close to peace. It didn't last forever, but it lasted long enough for me to breathe. A few weeks later, my father tried one final time. He used a work number I didn't recognize and caught me off guard. The moment I heard his voice, I hung up. That was it. No more explanations. No more defending myself. No more hoping they'd change. Melissa continued to recover slowly. I heard she had a long road ahead of her. I hoped she made it through. I truly did. But hope didn't equal obligation. I spent the next year focusing on myself in ways I never had before. I threw myself into my career. I traveled. I rebuilt routines that belonged solely to me. I learned how to exist without waiting for approval that would never come. And somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling guilty. I stopped replaying conversations in my head, imagining better outcomes. I stopped wishing my parents would suddenly understand. They wouldn't. They never had. 3 years passed. Life moved forward in ways I never expected. An opportunity came up at work, an international position I never would have considered before. It required relocating to Germany. A year earlier, the idea would have terrified me. This time it felt like freedom. I packed my life into suitcases and left. Germany was a fresh start in every sense of the word. New language, new routines, new identity, one that wasn't weighed down by my family's expectations. I learned how to be alone without feeling lonely. 8 months into living there, I met someone. His name was Lucas. He was kind in a way that didn't demand anything from me. Patient, steady. He didn't flinch when I told him about my past. He didn't try to fix it. He just listened. For the first time in years, I felt safe. That was when the past tried to knock one last time. Shortly before my move, Daniel reached out. He didn't come himself. He sent someone else. A mutual acquaintance delivered a book to my door with a note inside. An apology. Not just from him, but supposedly from Melissa too. They said they were sorry for how things ended, that they understood now how much pain they'd caused, that they hoped I was happy. I read the note once, then I put it down. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt done. Forgiveness, I learned, doesn't always mean reconnection. Sometimes it just means letting go of the weight. I forgave them quietly, and then I kept walking forward. Living in Germany taught me something I never learned back home. Peace doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with apologies or dramatic closure. It slips in quietly, on ordinary mornings, during walks through unfamiliar streets, in moments when you realize you're no longer bracing for impact. By the time I'd been there a year and a half, my life no longer felt like something I was rebuilding. It felt like something I was simply living. My job challenged me in ways that were energizing instead of draining. I learned the language slowly, imperfectly, laughing at myself when I mixed things up. I explored cities on weekends, drank coffee alone without feeling lonely, and slept through the night without waking up from the same old memories. Lucas became part of that rhythm naturally. We didn't rush anything. There was no urgency, no pressure to define what we were too quickly. He understood my need for space, not because I demanded it, but because he respected it. I told him everything eventually. Not all at once, not dramatically. Just the truth, piece by piece. He never asked me why I didn't try harder to reconcile with my family. He never suggested that time healed all wounds. He never implied that forgiveness required access. Instead, he said something that stuck with me. Sometimes distance isn't punishment, he said. Sometimes it's protection. That sentence settled something inside me that had been restless for years. 3 years had passed since my parents last screamed at me over the phone. 3 years of silence. And for the first time, that silence felt intentional. Chosen, not imposed. I still heard updates through relatives. Melissa had recovered enough to return home. The child was healthy. Daniel was still around. Life, apparently, had gone on. Good. I didn't need it to fall apart for me to feel validated. One afternoon, a message appeared in my inbox from an unfamiliar address. I recognized the tone before I recognized the words. It was from Daniel. He said he heard I'd moved abroad, that he hoped I was happy, that he'd done a lot of thinking during Melissa's recovery. That guilt had a way of catching up to you when you're forced to sit with yourself long enough. He apologized, not in a grand emotional way, just plainly. He said he didn't expect forgiveness. He just wanted me to know he was sorry. I read the email twice. Then I closed it. I didn't reply. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted to punish him, but because the part of me that needed acknowledgement from him no longer existed. Later that week, a package arrived at my old address, forwarded to me by a cousin. Inside was a book, one I'd once loved, a note tucked between the pages, handwritten this time. It was from Melissa. She said nearly the same things, that she was sorry, that she'd been selfish, that she understood if I never wanted to speak to her again, that she hoped I was living the life I deserved. I sat with that note longer than I expected. Then I placed it back in the book and put it on a shelf. Forgiveness came quietly, without ceremony. I forgave them because I didn't want to carry resentment anymore, not because they had earned it, but because I had outgrown the pain. Reconciliation, however, never came. And that was okay. I didn't call my parents. I didn't send updates. I didn't reopen doors that had only ever led to disappointment. The idea no longer felt cruel. It felt neutral. I had learned something important. Not all family bonds are meant to last forever. Some exist only to teach you what you will never tolerate again. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away and keep walking. Lucas and I stood on a bridge one evening, watching the city lights reflect on the river below. He asked me if I ever missed them. I thought about it. I missed the idea of a family. I missed what I thought I had. But the people themselves? No. I told him the truth. I don't miss people who only love me when it's convenient. He squeezed my hand and said nothing. That was enough. Looking back now, I see my life in chapters. Before the betrayal, during the collapse, and now, after. This chapter doesn't hurt to read. I'm not the villain my parents tried to make me out to be. I'm not heartless for choosing myself. I'm not obligated to step into roles that were never mine. I am allowed to protect my peace. And for the first time in a long time,